So actually, I am going to tell you where I am today because it's going to be a matter of public record very shortly, and it's extremely pertinent to what I'm talking about today and what Louis is doing today. So I'm actually in a virtual courtroom at the moment, waiting, which is going on in another room, waiting for an ex-CQC registered manager to receive a sentence for fraud on someone who's got a diagnosis of a learning disability. And what had happened was that they had no next of kin after their nearest and dearest obviously passed away, as often happens. And they ended up getting taken advantage of. And I discovered it on an audit, a spot audit that we did. So we're hoping this person's going to get a hefty prison sentence. So the only time I'll need to leave is if they call me in to the stand, but it's a guilty plea. So we're hoping it's just going to be the sentencing and I won't need to leave. But it really reinforces why we need CQC and why CQC actually pay a lot of attention, because there is still abuse going on in the sector, and they have to regulate that. So, you know, I have my moments for CQC, but actually, you know, there is a requirement for them because there's still bad people out there. And I think sometimes when we work in this sector, we think everybody's good and they're not. So that's just a little interlude as to where I am today in case I have to leave. So what I've badged this out as is how to thrive under CQC. So I'm just going to cover what's changed and what's changing. And hopefully that'll be a fairly generic overview with a learning disability focus. Then I'm going to talk about a different lens that they're applying to learning disability. And then we're going to talk about how not to be just compliant. And then we're going to hopefully cover off the deprivation of liberty safeguards, which was a very last minute topic from Louis. So apologies if that's brief, but specifically I focused in on learning disability placements and how that will affect them. So me, I want to introduce myself. So hopefully you know why Louis thinks I'm okay to talk about this subject. So I am self-employed, but I work as the head of regulation and care compliance for Fulcrum, which is the biggest consultancy in health and social care in the UK. I am, in practical terms, I'm a nominated individual and as an RM. I'm also a nurse and I still practice. I've held a variety of roles from inspector at CQC all the way up through to national clinical director for health inspectorate Wales and care inspectorate Wales, and I've done some other bits in between. So I've worked actually in social care as a director. I'm also a fairly seasoned expert witness in social care and regulation, and just as of today, officially, I am a CQC specialist advisor, and I also do some lecturing and stuff like that. So my background really is a bit varied. I get bored quite easily, but mostly I focus on regulatory matters and keeping up to date with what's going on in the kind of regulatory sphere. I find myself often, if it's on fire or there's a big problem, then I'm involved, and equally fighting a lot of battles with CQC. I do a lot of public speaking and that type of thing. So when we talk about change in CQC, hopefully you're all aware of this. I'm going to whiz through it, but there is some significant change coming through, and this is really the reason why. So we know that they've had major internal issues, and they came out in the Dash and Richards report. That included all kinds of things like the disastrous single assessment framework, the failed portal, and there's just been a huge kickback from the social care sector, massive delays with inspections, and right now they're in a place, I feel, well, they're almost at a midlife crisis, and they're in kind of like a PR management mode. And that becomes really relevant as we go through the slides as to why the lens is changing in how they look at the sector. So rest in peace, single assessment framework, scores and quality statements, they are gone, and they will be completely gone from November. So there's not going to be any complicated scoring. We're moving back to Chloe's. Now, it is sector specific, but the important thing to know specifically for learning disabilities is they don't have a specific inspection framework for learning disabilities, which I find really surprising because it's so different, and how you assess things within the sector is so different. So my prediction is that at some stage after they introduce the overall frameworks, there will probably be these sub-sector frameworks for things like elderly care, learning disabilities, but for the moment they're not sector specific for learning disabilities. So moving back to Chloe's, anyone who's been around for a while feels like deja vu, and we've got some ratings characteristics which is helpful because we actually know how they're rating. So the latest at the moment is that the pilot for that inspection framework is going to run between now and October, and then the final evaluation is going to be in November. So until October, it's going to run alongside, not instead of, the single assessment framework, which means sadly some of us might still be inspected under the horrible single assessment framework. They can have two reports. So if you're inspected between now and October, you can choose to have an inspection under the new framework and you will get two reports. My suggestion to all providers is do it, because you're going to get a very good understanding of what you're going to be under the new framework, and it doesn't go on the website or anything, so it's helpful just to have a different lens. The main test that they're looking at in this pilot is whether providers can actually understand how the ratings have been reached, because that's been a big problem for a long time, is that I don't think anyone really, there's no sense in how they're reaching ratings in a lot of the cases. So there's word on the streets. This is what I've heard but haven't confirmed with official statements from CQC. But basically, there's going to be no major changes from the extended consultation. So what we see now is probably going to be what we see. There is going to be an increased focus on learning disabilities, and I'm going to go into why that is. They are also going to have specialist advisor in every sector. So, for example, I'm going to be a specialist advisor in acute and social care. I think that's a really good move, because I think often when you've got an inspector, particularly a not very experienced one, talking to you in a very specialised setting, they don't always talk your language. So I think having a specialist advisor will add a little bit more balance and judgment in there. And it's somebody who's actually walked the walk, talked the talk. They know what you're going through on a day-to-day basis. They have a massive, massive focus on outcomes, and I've got a full slide on outcomes. Supported living is going to get a lot more scrutiny. And there is a mass inspection of home care, domiciliary care services. So essentially supported living comes into that as well. And that's because at the moment, around about 50% of first inspections in home care and supported living are resulting in an RI or an inadequate rating, which is just staggering. I've got my theories about why that is. I think it's something to do with COVID. Because the assessments during COVID weren't as robust. So I think some of those maybe who were registered at the tail end of COVID, actually the scrutiny wasn't applied as much as it should have been, and they've got through. The other kind of slightly dodgy practice that goes on, which CQC are aware of, but I'm not sure widely people are, is that a lot of people who registered during COVID, because it was an easy process, are actually selling their registrations. So they've remained dormant, haven't told CQC they're dormant, and they're selling the registrations. So what's happening is that perhaps a very poor provider who can't get registered will buy a registration and then they're in the sector. It's terrifying. So these are some dates. I will just leave these on, and you hopefully Louis will get the slides out to you. So one of the key dates I wanted to point out was September. So September is kind of like a watershed moment for CQC. They've got a target to publish 9,000 assessments by September, and there is no way they're going to fail that target, because they've had so much negative press. And what that means is there's going to be a ramp up of activity over the coming months. Like I said, failure is not an option for them, and it is about publishing. So what they're focusing on at the moment is urgent and emerging risks. And when they talk about that, the three things that I'm seeing them focus on is safeguarding as a whistleblowing and serious incidents. If you're hitting any one of those and your rating is over a year old, they're coming to see you. The other area they're looking at is no assessment since registration, very high risk. So if you provide a supported living or a home care service, I would say you are at the top end of having an inspection pretty soon, and ratings over 6 years old. So in terms of the landscape for learning disabilities, at the moment, there's about between 15 and 23% of learning disability services in adult social care are likely to be rated either RI or inadequate. That's about 1 in 5, which is quite high. It's certainly higher than the rest of adult social care. What you find in inpatient services is that almost 10% of those are being rated inadequate, compared with 1% in 2024. So that means that 10 times the amount has increased. That can be due to all kinds of things, pressure on the NHS, all kinds of factors. Why that's important for the social care sector is frequently they're seeing this, and there's this move towards putting people into the community. Very much what was being said when Louis was talking. How can we accommodate these as cheaply as possible? So we're seeing this move towards social care rather than inpatient services. And of course, it's following scandals such as Winterbourne New, and they've really focused heavily on closed culture. And I've just put the quote there that their most serious concerns have consistently centred on closed cultures, restrictive practices, and poor leadership. So these are just some this year of services that have been closed urgently. So these are, they're closing them. And these are some of the reasons: closed culture, safeguarding, MCA, poor governance, registering the right support, right care, right culture. That wasn't being met. Again, on the second one, you see safeguarding, staffing, person-centred care. And you can see kind of, as you go through, breaches of Reg 17, safe care and treatment, governance. You can kind of see the themes through all of these, and all of these were learning disability providers. So generally, I would say the top reasons that people get very serious outcomes from CQC when it comes to learning disabilities is if there's a poor and not meaningful way of life, if right care, right culture isn't followed, anything to do with governance and documentation and safeguarding issues. They would be my kind of top things at the moment that they're really focusing in on. What I've seen is that they are definitely more willing to cancel services quickly. So this one here, Plus Point Care Limited, that was an urgent suspension within 48 hours. That's very rare. So they are definitely looking at a different lens within adult social care and learning disability services at the moment. I've put some key documents in here, and I've dropped the links in so you can get them. So there's right support, right care, right culture, building the right support, and obviously the Oliver McGowan training standards. So these are some of the common themes. So I looked at kind of 300 reports to prep for this, and these I would say are the top areas. So restrictive practices, and I'm not talking like your kind of historic standard restrictive practices of, locked doors, things like that. Some of the things that I saw in the report were kind of more nuanced. So, for example, not allowing community access or not facilitating community access, restricting access to family members, restricting access to things like college and day centres. So they're definitely looking at restrictive practices in a wider setting and sense now. Poor governance comes up every single time. Every inadequate report you look at, every RO, it's always poor governance. And this is not undertaking audits. And what I've seen, particularly within supported living, this is becoming more prevalent. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about supported living. But gone are the days where supported living was treated like it was someone's home. It's very much now held to the same standards that a care home would be. And the way that they change that lens is by saying the people you're looking after often don't have the capacity to make big decisions. Therefore, you're advocating for them. Therefore, you have to make sure that their home is fit for purpose and all of the things that come with that. Like I said, limited community inclusion, that is coming under restrictive practices. I'm seeing more kind of increasingly. Weak person-centred outcomes. So they're really wanting strong outcomes with evidence of how people are moving towards those outcomes. And I've got some examples of really simple outcomes that you can measure that you will already be measuring mentally, but not putting down on paper. Lack of evidence of impact, that kind of links into the outcomes. Because what we're seeing is that people will have goals and outcomes within their support plans, but then we're not seeing what the impact of those outcomes are. Okay, great. So you're going out in the community more. Well, what does that mean? Why? So what is what they're saying. Environment and safety is massively increasing. And I would say this has been increasing for probably 6 to 8 months. And it's specifically in supported living. So I remember back probably 5 or 6 years ago, they didn't used to look at the environment in supported living because that's their own home, that's their flat, that's their tenancy. Now there's definitely a swing to them looking at the environment. So have you got a broken window? Is the cleaning products out? Are there knives in the kitchen? Have you done a risk assessment to check that they're safe? And you can't just kind of get away almost with saying, well, it's their home. Of course, they've got to have access to cleaning products. No, what they're saying now is actually because they've got an impairment of the mind and they may not be able to make a balanced and informed decision about that, it's up to you as the care provider to make sure that you're mitigating the risk in those environments. And that's definitely something new that I've seen coming through. And I've been kind of talking to our clients about it for a long time now. Records continually come up in most of the RI and the inadequate reports, and really poor language. So things like mum and dad have been to see them, nappies, that really just poor language that kind of either infantilizes them or makes it seem like they're in a care home, neither of which is often true. You know, they're usually in a supported living setting where they're supposed to be living like an independent life and enjoying their life. So just make sure that the language is reflecting. Honestly, you would release some of the examples that I've seen. And I think the key takeaway for the themes is it's a new game and there's new rules and you kind of need to know them. And I'm hoping with the new framework coming in, actually it'll be a little bit fairer, because I often refer to the single assessment framework as you've been thrown into a game, but actually no one's giving you the rules. Well, actually now they're giving you the rule book, so we have to make sure we adhere to it. So this is what I was saying about examples. So demonstrating impact. So for example, John attends college. That's not good enough. What they want to see is John's progressed from 1 hour weekly attendance to completing a level 1 qualification and gaining voluntary employment. That's a tangible impact. Staff support independence. So 14 people reduced paid support hours through increased independent living skills. They want to see the impact of what you're doing. A big focus off for them currently, and it will be increasingly so going forward, is tackling inequalities. A lot of this is centred around the NHS and the neighbourhood plans, but these are some of the things to consider, which I'm sure you already consider, but it's having those really tangibly in a dashboard so that you can say how you're measuring those. So if we think about inequalities in those living with a learning disability, often their physical health is much worse because of the medication, because of the neglect, because of the co-existing physical conditions. So things like annual health checks, cancer screening, healthy lifestyle support, that's all really important to make sure that's documented within their support plans. Oral health programs, so are they having regular dentists, things like that. Mental health access. So are we considering that people might actually have a mental health diagnosis as well as a learning disability diagnosis, and not just writing things off as behaviours when actually they could be a manifestation of low mood? And at least annual medication reviews. It seems to be a real kind of expectation now from CQC, is that there's at least annual medication reviews. And if you were going to put together an evidence dashboard, I would put probably these things on there. So how many people have got a health action plan? How many people went for screening last year? Have you got hospital passports? Are they up to date? And things like how many people have got reasonable adjustments in place? How many people have stopped smoking? Things like that, just so that you can tangibly show that you're increasing year on year and you're improving. So I often advocate having an evidence file, and the examples you want to show are things like this. So increased independence. So did they used to have 3 staff? Now they've got 2. Did they used to only go to the shopping centre, but now they go to college? Reduced restrictions. So actually, have they removed from 2-to-1 support to 1-to-1 support? Improved health outcomes. So, if you've implemented a healthy living plan with someone, has their HbA1c blood test come down? Have they lost weight? Have they stopped smoking? Things like that. And then I've just put all of these, but these are just some examples that you can pop into an evidence file to kind of show and demonstrate good or outstanding. And I would say this is the key question when you're going to ask yourself, when you're thinking about what you've done or what the staff have done, what changed because of it? If nothing changed, then you probably need to look at a different intervention. But it really challenges you when you're thinking about kind of standard outcomes of actually, is it changing anything? Is it making anything better? And that's kind of like the CQC dolls bit. So my tip for CQC would be all of that, and I'll send it through to you with the themed analysis as well that I did of the 300 reports. And I have to squash in dolls as Louie's request, but dolls has changed really significantly in the last 18 days. what's happened is that one of the most significant developments in mental capacity law since the Cheshire West judgment in 2014 has happened. So in 2014, you might remember, you definitely would have heard this phrase during your DOLS training. It's that a gilded cage is still a cage. And it was this kind of perception that somebody would be deprived of their liberty if they were under continuous supervision and they weren't free to leave. Didn't matter whether they were happy, content, compliant. If the restrictions were there, even if they weren't for their safety, you had to apply for a DOLS. And what's happened as a result of that is this, as you will know if you are in a kind of inpatient social care home, or even, you know, when we think about appointeeships, is this mass kind of application of DOLS. There's huge delays within local authority. And what I've said for a while in terms of my research, and particularly the work I do with the university, is that missing the point of the people who do actually want to leave, the people who are actually truly restricted. So I think this is quite a welcome ruling. But basically the Supreme Court now, and I've put the whole case reference here so you can link to it if you want to, what they've said is that that approach is too simplistic and that you need to have a wider, more nuanced assessment. So this is the biggest change. So under Cheshire West ruling, the gilded cage, a lack of capacity was an inability to validly consent. Now, the new ruling, they say a person may lack legal capacity under the MCA, but they might still be able to express wishes and feelings that amount to valid consent for their living arrangements. This means that a lot of people who were previously requiring DOLS may no longer require them. So, for example, if we're thinking about somebody who is unable to communicate at all on a ventilator, you know, would it be appropriate? They're not trying to leave. Or you've got someone who's very happy in their own flat or very happy in a care home if they're not trying to leave. So it's kind of for me, I think it's taking a much more balanced view. So I've done some specific slides on supported living because I think this is where you're going to see the biggest impact. So since the Cheshire West ruling, thousands, hundreds of thousands of supported living packages have required court of protection, appointeeship, community DOLS applications and Section 16 welfare orders, and then your annual reviews after that. And what they do is, and that's because obviously, as you'll know, being in the sector, most supported living services have 24-hour staff presence, which amounts to continuous supervision. And there's also restrictions on access to money, and there's positive behaviour support measures like, you know, redirection, and usually medications are managed by staff. So these issues would automatically previously trigger a consideration of whether there's deprivation of liberty. And, you know, if in doubt, refer, as has always been the position. What the Supreme Court have said now is that providers must consider what that person actually wants. Do they object to what's going on? And are restrictions imposed against their wishes? The overall context of those arrangements is really important. So when we're talking maybe about someone's medication management, actually, if they're happy to take their medication and you're giving it to them, that they're not objecting, then they probably don't need a DOLS for medication. However, if they're refusing and actually you need to go down a covert route, then you would need to go and have a think about community DOLS and all of that. So it's the overall context, you know, if they are continuously through all kinds of communication, whether that be physical communication of not wanting to go back to their own home, or they're not wanting to leave their parents or their family members, then that might trigger a DOLS. But the practical effect of that basically means that a lot of people who are in supported living placements for learning disabilities, autism, ABI and mental illness might not any longer require court protection authorisation if the person is happy and content with the arrangements and there's no evidence of them objecting to those arrangements. Why is my screen not moving? So what to do, which has been the biggest question, and it's really hot off the press. So on the 15th of June, the government has published some guidance on exactly what care providers should do. So what they've suggested as kind of a starting point is review policies, retrain staff, review your DOLS procedures, update your internal guidelines, reconsider those referral thresholds and continue to seek authorisation where there's doubt. And I've linked that publication there because it's got some really helpful advice. But if you're in England or Wales, the position's slightly different because, I mean, I'm Welsh, so I can say this. We always like to be slightly different in Wales. So in England, CQC have said the judgment's got immediate effect. It means that providers need to familiarise themselves with the legal development and adjust their practice accordingly. We recognise that this judgment may lead to questions about how different factors should be interpreted. But what they do is, what they always do is kind of put it in your court and give a bit of politician's answer. So they kind of say, well, everyone needs to be assessed on an individual basis, blah, blah, blah. But what they have said, which is important, is that they're going to adopt a proportionate approach in the assessments while they work with the sector to understand what the practical impact of that is. So that's CQC's statement, and I've linked it there for you to have a look at. In Wales, slightly different. So they said the judgment has come in and Care Inspectorate Wales are working closely to understand the implication. They say that it takes effect immediately and that it's uncertainty. In the meantime, responsible bodies and providers should continue to review current arrangements. Where you think changes to practice may be needed, seek legal advice. Now that's very different from CQC. What CQC is saying, implement it immediately, it's changed, off you go. CIW are taking a little bit of a measured approach and they're saying, actually, while this is in process, you probably need to seek legal advice if you want to defer or deviate from the current process. And what they have said as well is that CIW will take a proportionate approach to inspection, recognising that organisations are working to change their response. So it's slightly different, I would say. I would say CQC is saying change your policies, carry on. Wales are saying, actually, if you're going to change your policies, probably you need a lawyer to do that. So that's dolls. And I mean, I can answer any questions on it shortly, but I am not an expert because the judgment was literally 16 days ago. But I know a little bit about it, and I know a little bit where the sector's going with it. But I think certainly my take on it would be, if the majority of you are in England, is that you take that proportionate approach, look at that judgment in detail, reread these slides, and reread the government guidance and see where you sit, basically. And that's it. Question.
Do a lot of speaking on CQC, and it's very rare, and I mean this with all humility, that I watch a CQC talk where I learn a load of stuff, and this was one of them. So thank you so much, Katherine. It has been busy on the chat. There are views all over the place. I'm going to just raise a couple of questions that I think are really pertinent. So on the dolls piece, there's kind of two that have a similar link. Laurie had raised the idea that actually this ruling is quite scary. One of my concerns about the recent dolls developments is people with learning disabilities often adapt to restrictive environments and may appear content within them. How do we ensure that acceptance of an arrangement does not become a substitute for scrutiny of whether that arrangement is actually restrictive? And there's another similar vein of question from Florence. Is there an assessment to determine if someone is happy with the care that they are receiving, or will this be determined by an MCA? So I just want to know your thoughts on. I've got your points around Packery with dolls into oblivion, but how do we balance that with, just because someone's going along with something doesn't mean that it is something they are happy with or in their best interests?
Yeah, my view is there's somewhere in the middle, and I feel like what's happened is we've gone from one extreme and now we're going to go to another, and I think that's why the government have come out quite quickly with a position statement, because how do you assess whether someone's happy? I mean, I've got, anybody who knows me knows I've got a brother with severe learning disability. Now he would be, if you give him ice cream, he would be happy in hell. He would sit there and smile, he will, very much like what Laurie said, he will adapt, and he will become quiet and withdrawn if he's not happy. Not necessarily displaying kind of objections or I want to leave. So I think my concern with it, so I think there's lots of benefits, and I think most of the benefits actually are for care homes and elderly care, because care homes are just battered with kind of dolls. I mean, the care home I'm in today, 90% of the people here have got dolls. 50% of them don't want to leave and they're absolutely happy to be here. That's different, I feel, in supported living, because that's someone's home, and Often people are younger, often people can't express themselves in the same way that adults with dementia can. And my concern is, are we moving backwards a little bit to kind of Winterbourne View days, where, you know, if you're happy to stay in an asylum or an institution, if you're not making any noise, then actually you're content. What I don't think there is anything at the moment. I think what we have to evidence as providers is that we are making every effort possible to get people's views, whether that be, you know, employing things like different scales, pictorial tools, picking up on things like people being withdrawn, or, you know, one example is someone who maybe doesn't want to go back to their flat and wants to go to their mum's house. Well, that's an objection in my mind. So I think it's about making sure that we're documenting every possible communication we can. My prediction is that quite quickly, there will be some kind of guidance on this from national societies, royal societies, who will say, right, this is what constitutes an objection. If anyone shows this, then this is what you look at. But at the moment, I feel like it's a bit of a no man's land. And if there's any doubt, refer would be my advice.
Thanks, Catherine. I think there's really important points there. I think you've pointed to, and attendees have pointed to, there's a bit of an information gap that runs the risk of going in the wrong direction. I think, as you say, there'll hopefully be various societies and advocacy groups that will fill that gap. Some interesting points have been made. Oliver Lewis, a barrister on LinkedIn who's had quite a detailed response to this ruling that's worth checking out, has been recommended. James highlighted looking at not just what's being said, but any behaviour that's being seen that doesn't seem linked to their views on the environment, really kind of making sure that you're kind of clued in on that. Catherine, thank you so much.
No
It's been so helpful. We will be sharing the slides and we'll be making sure that information goes through. Do get in touch. No, go for it.
Yeah, just putting up 2 links for people. This is Lex Stannard. If anybody wants to take her details, she's our head of learning disability and specialist services in Fulcrum. She's got a wealth of knowledge, so she's quite handy to follow on LinkedIn and keep her email address handy. And that's my LinkedIn and my email address and my phone number. I'm not an expert in LD, but I am in CQC, and regulation. So if you've got anything CQC related, feel free to drop me a line or give me a shout. And like you said, Louis, you know, share the slides and I'll send over the analysis as well.
Catherine, thank you. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for the people that you are standing up for literally right now as we speak. And thank you for the presentation today. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you. Bye.